Greetings to Africans on the continent and around the world. This is King H. There are three particular articles that caught my attention, and I wanted to say something about this article. I wanted to express myself about this article. And the titles of these articles are: No country colonized by France has ever reached development. I got this article from howafrica.com. A Pan-African CFA activist is the face of rising anti-French sentiment in Francophone West Africa. And I got this article from QZ.com. France Emmanuel Macron makes promise to G5 Sahel countries. I got this article from National Telegraph. As you've noticed, all this article has to do with countries in Africa and France, particularly French African countries and France, and how influential or how the imperialism of France is connected to Africa. So I'm going to discuss the first article, I'm going to discuss one of the articles and then go to the next. A Pan-African CFA activist is the face of rising anti-French sentiment in Francophone West Africa. This CFA activist is a 38-year-old African who was born in France from Benin parents. He's a guy who started his movement, and the French government shut down his movement because they claim it was full of hate speech. So he decided to switch and started a whole new movement on the Pan-African revolution, Pan-African philosophy, Pan-African ideology, fighting against the imperialism of France, fighting against the abusation of French power on African nations. And this guy was actually put in jail for 4 days because he insulted the president of Burkina Faso. All this shit can only happen in Africa. When you get up and you insult the president, they arrest you. Sometimes they even beat you and do all kinds of stuff. The good thing about this fact is this guy was though he's an African, but he's an African with a French passport. So all they could do is put him in jail, and after 4 days they let him go. I mean, as a matter of fact, they are making sure some of the states in Africa are preventing him from visiting other nations in Africa. He was supposed to be in Senegal, but he was stopped from entering Senegal. So this is the stuff that the leaders of Africa are doing, because what he's doing is against French interests. It's against French interests, and they're trying to make sure to shut him down. But we, the youth of Africa, must continue with this spirit of Pan-Africanism and to fight neocolonialism in Africa from our own president, who are supporting the structure of French imperialism in Africa. Not only French imperialism, that goes as far as also including British imperialism in Africa, because the leaders of Africans do that so that they could stay longer in power, they could stay longer in presidency. For example, look at what is happening in Cameroon. You got a president who's been there for 37 years or 38 years counting. He's killing people. He's been killing people for so many years. And yet you have France supported him. It goes with the same thing with the president of Ivory Coast. It goes with the same thing with many of the French African nations. So long as they support the master, France, they have the right to stay there in power for as long as they can, or at least till death take them away. But the youths are waking up, and this guy, and I haven't even mentioned his name. His name is Kimi Sebath. He's the one who spearheaded the movement against regional currency, the CFA. And his movement is so big across West Africa and into Central Africa. Because you have countries in Central Africa that were colonized by France. And this is the kind of movement, Pan-African movement that we need. We need the youth to wake up. Is understand that we must change politics in Africa. We must change the image of Africa, the way the world looks upon African people and the way they interact and treat African people. They treat us as inferior across the whole world. But we Africans want to make sure that we change that standard. And we must start by kicking France out of Africa. France has been in Africa for 300 years, and I believe, at least close to 300 years. Among those countries that were colonized by France, none of the countries, have reached development. They are still in the developing stage. Why? I'll explain further. But so, yeah, let me move forward to the next article, which reads, "No country colonized by France has ever reached development." A statement that was made by a citizen of Ivory Coast. Her name is Natalia Yam. Natalia Yam. And Natalia Yam also declares that a country colonized by France has never reached developed stage. And why has countries that were colonized by France never reached developed stage? They have never reached developed stage because France benefit completely from the nations that they will colonize. France is still colonizing the nations that they colonize. Colonization, they might not be in the countries of France. Present is not heavily on those countries, but their influence in those French countries is really tremendous. It's very impactful that the nations cannot grow. But you have leaders, you have presidents in those nations who are only feeding they're only feeding French imperialism. They're only supporting French imperialism instead of supporting the nations, or instead of supporting their nation. And with that, French African nations cannot grow. ECO was supposed to be, or ECO currency was supposed to be for the French and the English West African nations. But what did France do? To make sure that they have a hand over it. To make sure that they have control over it, because that's a huge sum of resource. And France cannot allow that ECO should be controlled by the people of Africa. If it's being controlled by the people of Africa, then they will not benefit. They will not have their own bread. And how are they going to feed their people who are protesting in France because they don't want to increase the retirement age from 62 to 64? French citizen retire at the age of 62 and they have the full benefits after retirement. Where do you think that money comes from? Africa. Where do you think that money comes from? From Africa. The money that France has to pay those who have retired comes from Africa, which is why French African nations cannot grow. And Nathaniel is just saying exactly what I know, what I believe, what has been. That she declares that no country colonized by France has ever reached development stage. France cannot, and she went further to say, France cannot do this in this area. She wants everything for and only exclusively for France. All the resources that are available in French African nations are not for the people of Africa or the people of French Africa, but are for France. France control the resources. France make sure they select the presidents, the leaders of French African nations, so that those leaders will show complete loyalty to France and do the biddings of France. And she's from Ivory Coast. The president of Ivory Coast is a sellout to the people of Ivory Coast and Africa, to the point where he will literally kiss the feet or the ground that Macron walks. Not just Macron, but any president that comes up from France, he will do that. And which is why the president of Ivory Coast and the president of France decided to hijack the ecosystem and declared it so that they could reap the benefit of the eco currency. So Nigeria, before signing in with the eco currency, you must think twice and then look at all those buy clause that they've put in place, and make sure that the people of Africa are aware of this, so that we can stage a huge protest all over Africa to kick France out of Africa completely. And when we successfully kick France out of Africa, we'll make sure that for another 300 years, they will not be able to do any business in any nation in Africa. Being French or English, they will have no access to Africa whatsoever, because France being in Africa is draining the resources of Africa and draining the people of Africa. France must go. It's as simple as that. We can't deal with France anymore. And I'm going to conclude with the last article, where France Emmanuel Macron makes promise to G5 Sahel countries. This, as I said, this article was from National Telegraph. The president of France has announced that he's going to send additional 220 soldiers to the countries of the G5. And these countries are Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Mali. These are all West African nations. Most of them speak French. But we are supposed to be free as a nation. All these 5 countries are supposed to be free, a sovereign nation. Why is it that they must be connected one way or the other through France? Why is it that they cannot decide their own business without involving France? France must be involved in whatsoever they decide to do. Do you think French Africa has freedom? or even Africa in general has freedom. They don't. It's an illusion, because you have other people who are masterminding the movement of what is happening in Africa, of what is happening inside um, French African nations. Africa is not the master of their fate. It's not in control of how they do business or who they do business with. Other nations can do that because they are free, but Africa does not have the option to do that because Africa is not free. Which is why when we have little wars like the Islamic movement or whatever that is happening inside Africa, where they're killing other Africans in the name of religion, that is not even their own fucking religion. You're killing your own people in the name of a religion. That is not your own religion. A religion that it's an Arab religion that was brought in Africa, just like Christianity was brought in Africa. Sometimes I wonder what Africans really think. Like, how would you go and kill other Africans using somebody else's own religion so that you can implement that religion? The religion is not even yours. This is why nations like France can't even leave Africa. But at least Africans cannot even, the African leaders cannot even allow France to leave and other Western powers to leave from Africa. But we, the youth of Africa, must take control of the fate of Africa, for Africa and by Africans, without which we will continue to be slaves in this world. Why is it that France must be in control of how we do business? Why is it that France must be involved in order in order for other African nations to work with each other? These G5 countries in West Africa can come on their own and decide without the influence of France. And they do that by having contracts with France. So France, these 5 countries are paying France money to get rid of the Islamic movement in Africa, and yet not they haven't even done anything substantial. They only want to increase the military force. Well, by increasing military, by increasing the French military on the ground in Africa, who pays for that? The people of Africa will have to pay for that. The government in Africa. These 5 nations, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad will have to pay for it. You're contracting francs by paying them more money when you could decide to work together and keep the money within you guys, within your nation, and the people will not lack something to do when jobs are provided. But jobs cannot be provided because you're taking a huge sum of resources or a huge sum of money to pay France to bring in their military to come and fight and kill Africans, in the process of having a free what? This is just ridiculous. The people of Africa must wake up. We must wake up. If we don't wake up and become masters of our own nations, of our own continent. As you've noticed, they said China is trying to bring 300 million Chinese in Africa. You add 300 million Chinese in Africa, and then of China way to take over. Africans on the continent, they cannot feed themselves. Yeah, they're bringing 300, thinking of bringing 300 Chinese. And then you also have other Western nations in Africa. France must go. Must. And the leaders of Africa must start having a backbone to say no to France. They must have a backbone to say no to France. If they don't, then they should step down and give somebody else that can freaking rule the continent, or the countries and the continent of Africa. Because you can't be president and nothing is changing in your country, and yet you're hiring soldiers from other foreign nations to come and fight a war in your country. Meanwhile, your people don't even have the jobs and the finances to feed themselves. Does that make sense? This is King Echu. I'm out. Till next time.